Welcome to this new edition of Conversations with the Consul of Mexico in Boston. I'm Alberto Fierro, the Consul General, and we have a wonderful program today about José Clemente Orozco at Dartmouth College with our very, very special guest, Dr. Mary Coffey. Mary, thank you so much for accepting to share with us your expertise on Orozco and sharing with us the murals at your university at Dartmouth. Let me introduce Dr. Coffey. She's professor of art history at Dartmouth College, as I mentioned. She studied art history and cultural studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Before joining Dartmouth, she previously taught at Pomona College and was a faculty fellow and internship coordinator at New York University's graduate program in museum studies. Dr. Coffey's areas of expertise include Mexican muralism and the works of Orozco, Siqueiros, and Rivera, as well as cultural policy. She's the author of 2 books published by Duke University Press: How a Revolutionary Art Became Official Culture, Murals, Museums, and the Mexican State in 2012, and Orozco's American Epic, Myth, History, and the Melancholy of Race, published last year. She publishes extensively as well on American art, Latin American cultural studies, museum studies, and a broad range of visual culture-related topics. Mary Coffey gives public lectures and tours of the José Clemente Orozco murals at the Baker Berry Library, and she has taught many specialized courses on Orozco. So thank you again, Mary, for being with us. And before you share your presentation with us, could you tell us how you became so passionate about Mexican muralism?
Yes, so that's a hard question to answer because I grew up in Indiana, in the middle of the country, in a family. We had no relationship with Mexico. I'd never been to Mexico, and as a student in the United States, I didn't learn much about Mexico until I was in graduate school, actually. And it was in graduate school that I began to study Mexico and Latin America more broadly, and became really excited and interested in the mural movement because it was one of the few examples of modern art that I could see at the time that really felt like it connected the politics of avant-gardism with an actual kind of political movement and agenda. And I was really interested in finding or thinking about art that I felt was able to actually actualize some of the things that artists always think they're doing. And so I started exploring the topic in books. And then I had an opportunity to go do my first research trip in Mexico, which was the first time I'd been to Mexico. So I arrived a very naive researcher. And I think I always remember the first day I was in Mexico, I took the subway into the Zócalo and I came up into the Zócalo from below ground. And, there was the National Palace and the cathedral and the flag. And I just had this overwhelming feeling of awe. And I felt very much at home right away. I've always felt at home in Mexico City. And so I started going to visit the murals in person. And that was when I really, I think, understood in a real way the monumentality of this art, the ways in which you experience it in space and you move through those spaces and you build the stories in your head. And that's where it began. And then it just continued from there. I became very interested in, as you know, cultural policy. So I started exploring the topic, stories in your head. And I think we had a little feedback there.
Okay.
It's okay. Zoom.
It happens.
It happens.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I can imagine what it must be very impressive to come out of the metro and see that plaza, because Washington has a beautiful mall where the Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial are. So it is huge, but it's so big that it doesn't give this grandness that the Zócalo does. Yeah.
I think US Americans also, because we know so little about Mexico and we get so little information about Mexican history, that we don't have very accurate pictures in our head. And so I think, you know, I had been to Rome before I went to Mexico, and I had some experience with what it's like to be in a city with layers of history like that, and with buildings that have been around for centuries, which isn't something we experience in the United States. And so I think when I first arrived, that's when I sort of really understood that the history of Mexico is on the street. It's all around you. The entire built environment is layered with that history in a way that, you know, is not quite the case in the United States, where a lot of our buildings and our built environments are of relatively recent vintage.
Yeah. That's fantastic to know. And Mary, are you in Dartmouth because you were already an expert in muralism, or
Yes, I always joke that I am sort of following Orozco through the United States. So my first job was at Pomona College in Claremont, California, where Orozco painted his first mural in the United States. And I was, when I graduated from graduate school and I was on the job market, there was a temporary position at Pomona College, and I was hired precisely because I was a specialist in muralism, and they really wanted a scholar who would be teaching muralism using their mural. And then I went to NYU, which is just down the street from the new school. And so there's a mural there. And then I came to Dartmouth in 2005. And for the same reason, the faculty were looking for a scholar to add to the department who could really exploit the fact that we have this incredible enormous 24-panel mural cycle in our library that has been here since 1934, but that, you know, there's just an increasing interest in the mural on the part of the students, on the part of the college, on the part of the nation and the world. And so they were looking for a scholar who could help build that relationship.
And they found you.
Yes, they did.
Great. Yeah.
Lucky for me.
Yeah. No, lucky for both, I'm sure. I mean, because it's not that. I remember when I went the first time a year and a half ago, and you gave us a tour and the explanation, and it's very rare that you find someone so passionate about what they do, and you do have passion for the mural itself, and also the muralism movement. But tell us, what brought Orozco to New England and to Dartmouth College, and how he ended up doing the mural there?
Yeah, I thought to tell the story, I might put my images on the screen, because I think it's often more fun to learn with pictures than just to have someone tell you something. So I'm going to share my screen if you don't mind.
No, thank you.
Let's put this in share screen mode. Do I have the right screen or no?
No, we were seeing all the slides.
Yeah, I'll fix that. This is one of the challenges with Zoom when you have more than one screen, is it doesn't know which screen to pick. There we go. Is that better?
Yeah, this is fine.
So I start with this image because Orozco was, as I had just said, he had been doing murals in the United States. He'd been in the United States since 1927. I'm just going to skip ahead here a second. He had been at Claremont College, where he had painted a mural on the theme of the myth of Prometheus. And then he was at the New School for Social Research in Manhattan, where he had painted a mural between 1930 and 31. And so while he was doing that, there were two professors at Dartmouth College, these two guys over here, Artemis Packard, the fellow with the glasses, and Jerry Lathrop. They were both art professors, and they were very excited about the Mexican muralists, and they wanted to bring an artist to the college to be in residence to teach Dartmouth students the technique of fresco. And the reason for that was that the United States was very inspired by the Mexican muralist movement, and the U.S. would establish a couple of public art programs under the New Deal administration of FDR. And so American artists in general wanted to learn this technique that the Mexicans had revived from the ancient world, and they wanted to develop a public art initiative in the United States. So as art professors, they thought, let's bring a Mexican artist to the college. He'll teach the students how to do the technique of fresco. And then while he's here and we've got him and we've got a lot of interest in what he's doing, we'll start bothering the president of the college, who at the time was Ernest Hopkins, who you see in the center there. And we'll see if we can get President Hopkins to agree to pay him to paint a full cycle, a full mural cycle in the library. The library was relatively new. It had been completed in 1929. And so the president was interested, but it was the Depression, so he was a little worried about money. And lucky for us, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller's son, Nelson Rockefeller, had just graduated from Dartmouth, and the Rockefeller family was very grateful to the college for Nelson's experience here. And Abby was a great art collector and a great patron of Mexican muralism. And so she agreed to pay his salary through an anonymous gift. And so he was hired to be an artist in residence for a year. And so that's how he ended up here. And this is what he was doing initially, which was painting this mural that is now in a corridor that's just off the from the room where the larger fresco cycle is. And this was, we call the test panel, because this was the demonstration that he did to teach the students how to use fresco, the medium of fresco. And you can see him up there in the scaffolding painting the mural, and it's called Man Released from the Mechanistic to the Creative Life.
Wow. And so then he, after that, well, and it's interesting how the Rockefellers had to do with muralism so intensively. Yes. Yeah.
Just as a reminder, Diego Rivera was at Rockefeller Center painting his mural at the same time, also as a result of Abby Aldrich Rockefeller's intervention with her husband. Of course, we know that his mural was ultimately destroyed and repainted in Mexico City, but the two murals were happening at the same time. Both artists were experiencing a certain amount of controversy at the same time, but Orozco painted his mural at a college, and the college president defended it and said, you know, we don't destroy art, we don't censor art at the college. We like to entertain controversial ideas.
And did Mrs. Rockefeller get divorced of her husband after what happened in New York or not?
No, okay. Definitely not. But she did, you know, buy a lot of communist art.
And I'm sure that after what happened at the Rockefeller Center, she must have stopped at least sponsoring the Mexican muralists for a while. Yes.
Yes, everyone sort of stopped after that, mostly because I think everyone realized in the United States that letting artists, having avant-garde artists, giving them free rein was a dangerous proposition. So the period between the late 1920s and early 1930s is a really experimental period. And part of the reason it's so experimental is that people in the United States, patrons, corporate patrons and college patrons hadn't really had artists doing public art this way. And so they didn't think through all of the permutations, all of the possibilities, all of the consequences of that. They were just excited and swept up in the idea. And then once they actually recognized that artists are autonomous and they have their own ideas and their own politics, and you put something on the wall, it's up there for good, and you know you have to live with it. They thought differently about it, and so they put a lot more controls on the public art initiatives that the government sponsored through the WPA programs, the New Deal programs. And the Mexican muralists, as you know, went back to Mexico, where the Mexican government recognized, you know, we actually want them to paint on the walls down here because we're going to show those gringo capitalists that we will we will support this art. So Rivera found a welcome opportunity to repaint the mural that John D. Rockefeller and his company thought was too dangerous for Rockefeller.
Bellas Artes, yes.
Yeah.
And so tell us, how did Orozco come up with the epic of American civilization? Did he come up first with a title and then he created it? What is the meaning of the mural? Tell us a little bit or a lot about it.
Yeah, so I'll start here with this. Orozco's proposal to the college was just he wrote his ideas out on a little piece of stationery in the Hanover Inn. And this is what he wrote. The American continental races are now becoming aware of their own personality as it emerges from two cultural currents, the indigenous and the European. The great American myth of Quetzalcoatl is a living one, embracing both elements, meaning the indigenous and the European, and pointing clearly by its prophetic nature to the responsibility shared equally by the two Americas and creating here an authentic New World civilization. So this was the idea that he had. The question then of how he would pictorialize this idea was still open, and it seems as if the college president said, that sounds good, paint that. And then he spent some time working out his ideas, and he ultimately determined to focus the mural around the myth of Quetzalcoatl, which he argued in this statement was an American myth. Because we find iterations of this myth across cultures, and he'd always been interested in myth. He'd painted a lot of Greek myth, references to Greek myths at Pomona College, and so he started to think about how he could use this myth to explore what he called the American civilization, and he meant the Americas as a hemisphere, not the United States. And that's something that was quite common in the day. There were a lot of people doing what they called epics at the time. So James Treslow Adams published a book called The American Epic, in which he coined the phrase the American Dream. Thomas Hart Benton did a series of a mural called the Epic of America. So there were a lot of artists and intellectuals and filmmakers exploring this idea of the kind of epic story of America. But Orozco's, I think, saw those as relatively narrow and that they were really only thinking about the United States. And he wanted to sort of counter that parochial impulse by providing people in the United States with a hemispheric epic, or an epic that encompassed all of North America, not just the United States. And so for him, the myth of Quetzalcoatl allowed him to do that. And so the way that he did that was to use this rectangular corridor. You can see this is Baker Library up at the top here. This is a view of the mural in situ, and this is a schematic overview of the mural that shows where all the panels are placed. And so this is a long rectangular corridor that has a break at the center where there's a reserve desk. And so the mural is organized around the left, or what we might call in this orientation, the west, the north, and the east walls. And then there's a reserve desk at the center that kind of breaks the mural into two halves, and the halves are equal in scale and in dimension. And so on the left half of the mural is the ancient Americas, and on the right half is the modern Americas. And then he tells the story of Quetzalcoatl along the western half of the mural. And then the mural, after the reserve desk, the break of the reserve desk, picks up again with the story of the conquest. And I can talk a little bit about how he was thinking about that. I just want to note before showing a few more scenes is that across from the reserve desk, there's a little niche. And in that niche, he has a picture of this reading worker called Modern Industrial Man. And that worker is reading a book and doing the same thing that the Dartmouth student that comes into this reserve reading room to check their books out in this little center desk here is doing. So there's a relationship that he's setting up between the student checking their book out who turns around and then sees this figure on the wall. And the imagery in this niche mediates between the ancient and modern American scenes. And so one of the things he does is he divides the mural pretty much 50-50 between indigenous civilizations, really focusing on the ancient Mesoamerican indigenous civilizations of the Americas, and post-conquest or sort of Euro-American history. So rather than starting his epic with the arrival of Europeans, which was typical in the United States, he starts with the great civilizations that preceded the arrival of Europeans. And then instead of presenting European arrival as the sort of beginning of an evolution or a progressive history towards greater and greater achievement, he suggests that that is a kind of traumatic break or rupture with the past that produces a very dystopian modern world. He also sets up these relationships across the corridor between time and space. So we have ancient human migration opposite modern migration of the spirit, ancient human sacrifice opposite modern human sacrifice. And so he uses that mirroring across the corridor to ask his viewers to think about the relationship between modern human sacrifice, which is how he characterizes modern warfare. And this is a mural that he's painting in 1932 after World War I, after the Mexican Revolution, but also during the rise of fascism. So he's thinking very intensively about world war and the ways in which humans consistently go to war and sacrifice conscripted soldiers in the name of abstract principles like empires and nations, and suggesting that that's really no more civilized or no less barbaric, if you will, than the forms of human sacrifice that were practiced by the Aztecs. And so here's an example in the mural where he's really questioning a US American viewer's idea that the ancient world or indigenous civilizations were less civilized than the modern world, and instead suggesting that maybe our belief in progress should be questioned. In terms of the Quetzalcoatl myth, do you want me to relay the story of Quetzalcoatl in broad strokes? Mm-hmm. This is a myth that refers to an ancient Toltecan god as well as leader. It's pretty much viewed today as a story that was sort of created after the conquest in between the Spanish and the defeated members of the Aztec nobility as a kind of explanation for the conquest. But in 1932, it was very much understood to be an indigenous or a pre-Columbian myth that Orozco, that sort of prefigured the conquest of Mexico. And so the idea in the story goes that an enlightened leader arrived on the shores and brought with him a kind of monotheistic civilization. Civilization flourished under his benevolent leadership, and then his people rejected him. And as he departed, he left a prophecy that the world that rejected him would be destroyed with the arrival with his return. And the argument went that when Cortez arrived on the shores of Mexico in 1519, in the same year that the prophecy was supposed to be fulfilled, that the Aztecs believed that Cortez was Quetzalcoatl returning to destroy their civilization. And this was understood to be a prophecy that, in a sense, prefigured the conquest. And so Orozco uses that, and that's what I think he means when he's referring to the prophetic nature of the Quetzalcoatl myth, why he's talking about it as a living myth, and why he thinks it's a myth that's shared by both the indigenous and European civilizations, because both civilizations understood Quetzalcoatl as a kind of prophetic figure in their own histories. And so I can show you really quickly how he tells the story of Quetzalcoatl. We see him arriving at Teotihuacan, which is a Toltec civilization, and he sort of kind of emerges from between these two pyramids, where we see kind of sleeping civilization, and he kind of subsumes all of the features of these various pagan deities into a singular monotheistic figure. And under his leadership, people begin to sort of develop the civilization. The second panel then details the golden age of Quetzalcoatl's rule or reign, where we see agriculture and cultivation, the cultivation of the arts and the development of astronomy and mathematics. And then we see his rejection, the people rejecting him, turning back towards their sort of barbaric ways. And he's pointing off into the distance as he sort of rides out into the sea. And what he's pointing to, of course, is this image of arriving conquistadors, which is the panel titled The Prophecy. And that is located at the very edge of the ancient half of the mural. And those conquistadors face these Aztec warriors that are depicted at the far end of the wall. And so you get this relationship across the story of Quetzalcoatl between the imperial Aztecs who use the story of Quetzalcoatl to sort of subdue central Mexico, and the imperial Spanish who use the story of Quetzalcoatl to sort of defend their conquest. And so Orozco is showing that this myth is shared essentially by two civilizations who sort of inevitably come together as prophesied in the myth of Quetzalcoatl. However, when you cross the threshold, when you go across the room, you pass through the space that the reserve desk opens up, that becomes a kind of rupture between the ancient and the modern world. And we see at the very first scene on the other side of the room is the arrival of Hernán Cortés and the Christian conquest of the Americas. And so Orozco shows this event in two different guises. In the ancient world, he represents it as a prophecy, and in the modern world, he represents it as a historical fact that sort of inaugurates the arrival of Europeans and the imposition of Christian civilization in the Americas. And that story then gets told across the modern half of the mural. And that story begins with Cortez's arrival and seems to end with the arrival of Christ, who becomes a kind of returning figure who destroys the civilization in a kind of last judgment scene. And in that way, Orozco is suggesting that history as we understand it in the secular world is really premised on the eschatological narrative of the life of the sort of millenarian sort of argument for the conquest. And so he's showing how that story underpins our secular understanding of history, as well as the Spanish argument for the conquest of the Americas. So he's really setting up a kind of contrast across the mural between the sort of time of prophecy and the circular logics of Mesoamerican civilizations and histories, and the linear logics of Judeo-Christian conceptions of time and history. And so this is a kind of juxtaposition on his part between two different epistemologies, two different ways of understanding the world and time and history and the past that kind of collide, if you will, in this moment.
And in this second panel, he mixes elements of US history with Mexican history, which I would think, now today we insist that we have a common history, but in that time it must have been very, very a very new approach.
Yes, it was. I mean, I still think it's not usually how American elementary education children are taught the history of the Americas or North America. They're still taught essentially that our history, if you will, begins with the arrival of the Pilgrims. And they may never learn until they go to college about the Spanish presence in, the half of the United States in the Southwest, and certainly they don't learn much about the Mexican-American War. Some schools they do, but not many. And so Orozco, I think, understood very clearly that the people he was painting for really didn't know the history of the Americas. They knew US history, but they didn't know the history of the Americas. And so he's really reframing US American history within a broader hemispheric story. And so he really, if you will, he kind of marginalizes US American stories and situates them into a larger sort of series of images that speak to the whole history of Europeans in the American, well, not the whole, but the Spanish arrival is the moment he emphasizes. And so that modern sequence then goes from Cortez and the Cross, this image of the conquest, which in the United States in the 1930s would have been thought of as something that has nothing to do with US American history. They would have thought, well, that's the black, and there was the black legend, the idea that was terrible. That was a conquest. It was
those ugly Spanish.
Those ugly Spanish, they did terrible things, but we didn't do that. We just settled the land peacefully and we had a Thanksgiving. That was kind of the idea. And so Orozco is saying, no, first of all, half of the United States was under Spanish dominion. So this is part of your history already, but also the US mode of settler colonialism is fundamentally no different than the Spanish conquest mode of colonialism. They both, were forms of European colonization, and they have different temporalities and they have different relationships with indigeneity, but they were both colonial projects. And so the United States doesn't get to imagine itself as exceptional within the region, but needs to be thinking about how its history is a part of this history as well. And so the mural sort of jumps from the Spanish conquest to this panel called The Machine, where we sort of move from the 16th century into the 20th century with an image of industry, which in the 1930s, again, was really associated with the United States. The United States was sort of fashioning itself and viewed in the region as the sort of industrialized North, where these Henry Ford's River Rouge factory was sort of modernizing assembly line manufacturing and all of that. And we know that Diego Rivera in Detroit, he paints a beautiful mural that really celebrates American industry and the factory in particular. But Orozco's vision of industry is much more ambivalent. And his depiction of industry is dehumanized. Machines kind of run amok. It sort of looks like an apocalyptic scene. And that's the scene that mediates between the Spanish conquest and the image of Anglo and Hispano-America. And so one of the things that I think is important to notice here is that this pile of corpses beneath Cortez's hand, right? These are sort of dead Amerindians in the image, are literally being fed into, sorry, I have a bunch of fancy things, fed into this thresher. This arm of this figure is being kind of twisted, and that it's as if these bodies are being fed into the industrial machines. And then this thresher, this kind of agricultural thresher, sort of spins out these gray organization men in the Anglo-America panel. So he's really suggesting formally here through the visual elements that there is a relationship between modern US America and the sort of the violence of the conquest, the dispossession of indigenous peoples, and the exploitation of their labor and their lives. And that's something that people in the United States in the 1930s would have thought was, crazy talk. They didn't see themselves as having any relationship to that history. And then the next two panels of the mural really focus in on what in the period, when you have a lot of conversation about Pan-Americanism, was referred to as Anglo and Hispano-America, as if these were two different things, as if there was a Hispano-America that was wholly distinct from Anglo-America. And while Orozco pinpoints that in this mural by sort of sifting them out and presenting these kind of caricatured images of what Anglo-America is and what Hispano-America is, ultimately, I would argue that he's rejecting that idea. He's suggesting that first of all, you can't separate Hispano-America from Anglo-America. They have a shared history. They're intertwined. There are Mexican Americans, and there are, it's not all Anglo-Americans are Protestants from New England. But in the mural, he really takes the sort of the caricature of these two different nations and these two different religious cultures, you know, the Protestant US American and the Catholic and sort of violent Hispano-American, and he kind of heightens those caricatures in order to make fun of them, to suggest that they're inaccurate. And so in the Anglo-America panel, he presents Anglo-America as this kind of zombified population where nobody is an independent, nobody thinks as an individual, there's no creativity, everything's been sort of packaged and controlled. The wheat is a little cube. You know, the Protestant schoolhouse and the barn, these kind of features of the colonial revival and the sort of regionalism of the period, these of Americana, essentially these icons of Americana. And then these sort of American citizens who've gathered together for some kind of town hall gathering. But I mean, my students usually see this panel as very much like a horror film, you know, like zombies kind of coming together because everybody looks so sort of terrifying and miserable. And he even uses the sort of idea of a grid to really suggest that the United States or the Anglo-America is this really regimented, controlled, individualistic society in which everybody is an individual, but they don't have any sort of a passion or soul. Whereas in the Hispano-America panel, right, we see the heroic peasant a warrior at the center of the mural who has a sort of resemblance to Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. So he's thinking about these revolutionary leaders who really fought to defend Mexico's subsoil resources, Mexican workers, and the sort of agrarian platform of Zapatismo. But they are surrounded, or he is surrounded by all of these kind of generals and businessmen who are exploiting Mexico, you know, sort of grabbing for the coins that are spilling out of the bag, which is a representation of the enormous wealth of Latin America in terms of resources, but the ways in which those resources are being extracted and monopolized by foreign owned companies, often with the collusion of corrupt officials, but also through unfair, what we call economic policies, international economic policies and trade policies. And so in this mural, this figure, while he's heroic, he's about ready to be assassinated by an American general. So there's a real pretty stark critique here of US intervention in Latin America generally, and also of the role that the United States played in the kind of cycles of instability that Mexico had been suffering since the Mexican-American War. And so all three of these panels then come together to sort of wedge Anglo-America between these two episodes that are, you know, the Spanish conquest and the kind of so-called Hispano-America of the 1930s. In Orozco's mural, he's trying to insert Anglo-America into that larger Spanish story rather than suggest that it's exceptional and it's not a part of that larger story.
No, Mary, in Mexico, many of the muralists, at least at the very beginning in the 1920s, they wanted to tell the story, history of Mexico. It had the idea of being pedagogically. Mm-hmm. Do you think that Orozco was thinking that his mural would be a tool for the students at Dartmouth to learn about their world?
I do, and I think the reason for that is this panel that I mentioned at the beginning, right, where we see this man, this working class man. He's wearing workers' coveralls and he has gloves and there's a hammer next to him and he's wearing a worker's cap. And we see him kind of reclining in front of a building that's under construction and he's reading a book. And Orozco based this figure on a Dartmouth student model, who you can see here in this sketch below here. So the model for the figure was a white Dartmouth student, because at the time, most of the Dartmouth students, they were all men and they were almost all Protestant and they were all white. There were a few students of color, but not many. And so Orozco based the figure on a student, and the figure is meant to reflect the student's activity in the library, but then he transformed the figure from a kind of elite white male Dartmouth student to a working class man of color, which is a kind of figure that, you know, we wouldn't have found at the college in 1930. And so I think Orozco is, on the one hand, asking the Dartmouth student to really reflect on to reflect on their, what we would call their privilege today, to reflect on their relationship to the working classes, who in the United States, as in many places, are largely people of color, and to think about their education. You know, to what ends are they putting their education? Are they putting their education to the ends of a kind of generalized human liberation, or are they putting their education in the service of perpetuating, you know, classism and racism and other forms of privilege that are commonplace throughout the world in the 1930s and today? And so I do think he imagined the mural as a kind of epic journey, so that if you're in the corridor and you're moving around its the space, and you're looking at these images and you're trying to understand the mural and you're thinking about what you see, he's hoping that there's a kind of transformation that happens in that process, and that transformation kind of shifts your thinking as a student out of your habituated ways of thinking about US history and its relationship to the rest of the world, and that you start to think about yourself maybe as a hemispheric subject, as someone who understands that they're part of a larger whole, and that their history needs to be reframed in order for them to adequately and accurately understand their environment. And one of the things that I think is important to remember about this time, you know, we tend to edit out our history all the time. We edit all the bad stuff out, focus on the good stuff. But the 1930s was the high point of xenophobia in the United States. We had, you know, the Immigration Exclusion Act of 1924 that brought immigration to a halt. And in the 1930s, the United States government was forcibly repatriating Mexicans, including citizens. Is essentially deporting Mexican workers. And in the parts of the United States, you would find things like this: signs barring Mexicans from participating in work, from accessing services, on the basis of the same kind of racism that we think of as associated with the Jim Crow South. And so Orozco's aware of this. He writes in his autobiography about some of the incidences of racial prejudice he encountered, even though he himself is an elite, kind of an educated, Spanish descended Mexican. But he recognized in the United States that he was being viewed through this racial lens and experiencing forms of discrimination, even though he was quite privileged as an artist. And so I think all of that is in his mind when he's thinking about how he wants to address his Dartmouth student viewer, and also what he's hoping his Mexican standpoint can teach them about their own history.
So you've written in your academic work defining Orozco as a call for justice, which it's interesting the times we have lived the last year regarding race, immigration, borders, nationality. It is interesting how contemporary a 1930s mural has become. What is the reaction of the students? What's the reception today of the mural at Dartmouth? What can you tell us? And we have a question also from one Roberto Gomez, who is watching this, that says the idea that some art at some point becomes dangerous is very interesting. Would you say that there is currently an equivalent of that idea in place? But I think I asked too many questions at the same time. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I'll start with the question of the students, and then I'll talk about dangerous art. So the mural has always been pretty popular with our students. I give tours to alumni every summer. We have alumni groups come through every summer, and they're very popular, not just because I'm giving them, but because the students remember the mural. They spend a lot of time in this space because it's a very popular study area. And for years, it was where students checked out books that were held in reserve that they couldn't check out permanently, but they needed to read in the library. And so it's very used space. And therefore, many generations of Dartmouth students have been in that room, spent a lot of time looking at those walls and really grappling with the complexity of the mural, because the mural is not didactic. It does not tell you what to think. It gives you a series of very provocative images that are very complex in how they're put together. And then he kind of expects you as a viewer to do the intellectual labor of trying to understand them. And so a lot of the students that I meet through these, or the alumni that I meet, they talk to me, they tell me the memories they have, but they also say, I never understood that, or I was always wondering about that, so they spent a lot of their lives thinking about the mural, and they're curious about it, even sometimes they're in their 80s, and they're still asking me questions about the murals. They've been thinking about them since they were college students. Current students at the college, of course, are quite diverse. We have a very diverse student body, a lot of students of Mexican descent, including students who are Mexican citizens, but also, students who are Latinos of various kinds, African-American students from the Middle East and Asia. And I get all of these students in my classes, and they are all really interested in the mural, in part because I think for students, especially students who don't come from New England and aren't part of the kind of elite sort of Protestant upper class, the mural is a place where they feel like there's always been a place for me at Dartmouth. This mural's been here since 1932, but the college welcomed a Mexican artist to paint on its walls and put something permanent there. So they feel attached to the space because it seems to affirm that there was a place for them at the college all along, and here they are now. And then they use the mural, for their own kind of political purposes. So they'll often take imagery from the mural in their student publications and make satirical drawings about the college, or, and sort of pick up on the satire that Orozco was known for, and the kind of the biting political humor that he uses to sort of critique things they don't like about the college or things they don't like about the modern world. And so on balance, I would say the mural's quite popular and viewed as a resource, a political resource, a cultural resource, a historical resource. It is dangerous. I think we're really lucky that the person who was president at the time, Ernest Hopkins, was kind of a socialist, and he was a kind of a contrary character. And so I think even though he had a lot of alumni writing him and complaining about the college hiring a Mexican artist to paint these terrible murals, modern murals on the walls in the 1930s, he really defended the murals and said, I'm not an art critic, but I'll let time decide, and over time we will know if this is a great work of art or if this was a terrible work of art. And he thought, in the future we can make that decision. And I think he was borne out in his hunch that this was going to be viewed over time as a masterpiece, which it really is. I don't use that language often because I like art and I don't care if something is a masterpiece or isn't, but I do actually think this is a masterpiece. This is one of Orozco's most important works of art, and it is complex, and it's very important in his own trajectory. It's the mural that really, where he finally kind of solidifies his style, his point of view, and then he goes on to paint some of his best work in Mexico, in Guadalajara and Morelia, and Mexico City after he paints here. So art is dangerous. It's always dangerous. This is why we don't have a lot of public art anymore that gets executed without a lot of controls placed on the artist. This is one of the things that makes the 1930s such an exciting time for art historians, because it was such an experimental moment. It was such a moment where there was such an openness to radical culture and to the idea of socialist solutions to problems. And so people were willing to take these kinds of risks at the time because it felt like everything was changing. I'm sad to say that not much has changed since the 1930s. Unfortunately, I feel sometimes like we're right back there in terms of living with the threat of fascism and the kind of xenophobia that was really rampant at the time, and the forms of violence against the poor, the working classes, and in our country, really the rural poor and racial minorities. And so this is partly why I think the mural is still so powerful, is because it feels very relevant to the world that we're living in.
And one last question, and if you want to close up with a reflection, but last year at the Whitney, there was this big exhibition showing something that I don't think it had been shown in that way before, of how important Mexican muralists were in influencing American modern art. Maybe not doing this type of art so politically charged, but it did influence many of American modern artists. Do you agree with that? What would your take on that be?
Yeah, well, I will say that the scholars who work on Mexican art, this is something we've known for a very long time, and I was really thrilled to see that through the Whitney, a broader public was becoming aware of this fact. It's a fact. It's not even a theory. It's a fact. And I would note that in the 90s, there was an exhibition called South of the Border that James Olds curated, where he really showed very carefully how many artists from the United States went down to Mexico in the 1920s and 30s, how many Mexican artists came to the United States, and all of the ways, all of the cultural exchanges that were taking place at that time that were fundamental to the development of American modernism, including American design. If you think of things like Fiesta ware and the kinds of industrial designs or architecture that's rooted in the sort of Neo-Mayan and Neo-Aztec styles, etc. So I 100% agree with the thesis of the show and the argument that exhibition made. And I would go further and say that Mexican muralists didn't just influence U.S. American artists, they did, and all the ways that the exhibition explores, but also that the ways that the Mexican artists found to articulate an authentic modernism, a modernism that felt rooted in American history and culture and ideas, as opposed to a modernism that was sort of imported from Europe. Mm-hmm. And the way the Mexicans did that, right, was by reinvestigating the pre-Columbian history of Mexico, and of researching and collecting and being a part of that generalized cultural revival that was so important to Mexico in the post-revolutionary period. And in the United States, that was a real influence, not an influence, that was a kind of model for people in the United States who were also looking for a way to say, we have a unique modernism. We are not derivative modernists. We are not deriving our sense of modernity from European authority. We have our own kind of experience here, and we need to celebrate it. We need to embrace it. And it is authentically ours, as opposed to trying to find a way to prove that we're like European artists or European culture. And that, that ability to really feel confident in your own cultural traditions is something that I think U.S. American artists and critics took from the example of the Mexicans. And it was essential. Without that ability to turn inwards, if you will, to sort of think about the place in which they inhabited, we might not have the same kind of post-war art that we have. American artists needed a kind of guide, if you will, in the development of that kind of national cultural identity. And so I'm very pro that idea. And I think Mexican artists contributed in really important ways to things like the emergence of democratic print culture in the United States.
Yeah,
They
definitely.
were, Orozco participated in anti-lynching campaigns. I mean, these artists were not just painting murals, they were involved in political movements in the United States. They were involved in attempts to democratize art in the United States. They were involved in working class unions in the United States. They were involved in a lot of things that were really, really important in the history of the United States.
Yeah, and so closing up, this mural is the witness of a shared history between the US and Mexico in last century, but that has come all the way, almost it's 90s, it will be 90 years very soon. So 90 years of common history in New England, of Mexican art and the everyday life in a university in Dartmouth. Mary, thank you so much for sharing with us all this. I suppose that anyone that wants to go, once COVID is over and the university opens up for everyone, people can go and visit the mural.
They absolutely can. And so the mural room is open to the public. And so anytime between, I think, 9 and midnight on a weekday, you can walk in the building and see the mural for free without anybody bothering you. We've also produced a lot of online materials that give you a pretty good access to the mural. So we have a website called the Digital Orozco website, and there you can scroll through the whole mural and you can see all the preparatory drawings. It's very interactive. Mm-hmm. We've got an audio tour and we've got a digital Matterport tour where you can see a 3-dimensionalized version of the mural on your screen, and you can move or navigate around it and sort of click on different hotspots that will give you an audio recording that explains the panel or the idea or the figures in the mural and gives you some textual information, as well as the pamphlets that we pass out in the library itself, but they're also available online. So there are a lot of ways to sort of engage with the mural in person, but also remotely during COVID.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. I hope that many of the people that hear this conversation will be willing to visit you very soon. Thank you for your time and for your passion for Mexican art.
Thank you.